So, as we talk about this, it may bring up a lot of negative emotions for you. And so, it is important that we equip you with some tools to process those negative emotions. Because the tools that are typically used, whether by yourself or from others that are trying to help, are often pretty ineffective. So, a couple of common tools that people use is people will use things like problem solving or reassurance. And these two tools are ineffective for pretty much the same reason, which is that they actually dismiss your emotions. So if you come to someone with a problem and they just try to offer you a solution, what it does is it says, I don't want that emotion to be there. I don't want you to be sad. I don't want to be around you when you're sad. So I'm just going to offer you a solution. It comes from a good place. It doesn't come from a malicious place usually. But that is sort of the message that our emotions receive. The other tool that people use, which is reassurance, does sort of the same thing, which is it says, no, 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 don't feel the emotion that you're feeling. It will be okay. And I think that a lot of times people confuse reassurance and validation. Because validation is actually saying, hey, it actually makes sense that you feel this way, and here's why. And I think that the reason that this is so counterintuitive, the reason that not a lot of people know how to validate or use validation in their communication, is because it doesn't seem like it should do anything. Like, you're not solving anything. You're not doing anything about it. You're just sort of like saying that you understand the person. But strangely, when you validate effectively, what tends to happen, so as we get upset, imagine your emotions are sort of like blowing up like a balloon, right? So, something happens and you are triggered in some way and your emotions blow up like a balloon, right? They get really, really big and hard to deal with. As someone validates you, even if it's yourself, what tends to happen is that that balloon starts to deflate. As the emotions feel like heard and understood, the emotions start to deflate. One of my favorite analogies that I heard for validation is that someone once told me that validation sort of feels like a warm blanket. And I think that that's pretty accurate. So I'm going to give you the formula for how to validate. It's a two-step process. Step one is tell the person, even if it's yourself, that what they are feeling makes sense. And then step two is tell them why it makes sense. So as an example, it makes sense that you feel really sad and devastated right now because someone that you love just passed away. That sounds really hard. That's an example of validation. One really important thing to keep in mind is that validation is not the same as agreement. So let's say that you're talking to a friend and they're really, really angry. And they say to you, like, they just got out of a bad relationship and they say, like, I just want to like slash his tires or something. And you want to validate that statement, you may feel hesitant to do so because, like, you don't want to encourage your friend to like slash her ex's tires. And so it is not about saying, yeah, you should slash his tires. Again, if you follow the formula of validation, it is saying, I can really understand why you would feel so angry right now because the way that he treated you, XYZ example, seems really, really unfair. Whereas if you said something reassuring like, no, don't slash his tires, it'll be okay, you'll get over it, it just makes the person feel more isolated and alone because they don't feel heard and understood. Or if you jumped to problem solving by saying, like, you know what, we need to get you into therapy right now, your friend might not feel ready to take that step. And so by being with them and sitting with them in that emotion and validating that emotion, it helps to decompress the emotion. And then they may discover that underneath the anger is a whole lot of sadness. And so they may start to cry and be able to get some of that emotional energy out. Anger is a shielding emotion. It is there to help protect other emotions. So when you feel sad or hurt, anger will come in on top in order to protect the sadness and hurt and ultimately try to sort of correct the situation. Anger is a sort of motivating emotion that drives you to take action. And so anytime that you feel anger, It's good to validate the anger, and it is also good to ask yourself what is it that is underneath the anger here. And it's a really interesting process because as you validate your anger, sometimes this process will happen where the anger starts to grow until a breaking point, at which point the other emotion that's underneath starts to seep through, like sadness, for instance. And so by being aware of this, you are able to more fully validate your emotions because you're not just validating the anger, you're also validating whatever it is that is underneath it. Another really important tool in emotional processing is understanding your triggers, understanding where things are coming from. So I would recommend getting something that you can write in, whether it's digitally or physically, but some sort of like journal that you can write in. I will ask you questions throughout this course where I will ask you things like, when is the first time that you remember being made to feel small? And I'll ask you to write about that. And the reason that this is important is because oftentimes we will be trying to deal with some sort of emotion in the present. And even though we logically understand the situation, our emotions will still feel activated. And people will get really confused about this because they'll be like, yeah, like I feel okay about this situation. I don't know why I still feel upset. And the reason that people still feel upset after they have come to understand a situation is usually because the emotions that they are feeling are not actually about the situation that is happening. The situation that is happening served as a trigger to something that happened in the past. And so first we have to identify what it is that the mind is connecting to. Because what sort of happens is that our mind is really good at associations, and this is a really useful skill. So as a sort of funny example, if you go to a place that you've never been before, and there's a stove that you've never used before, how is it that you know how to use that stove? You've never used it before. What our mind does is it takes what we have seen before and says, oh, this actually looks kind of similar to this. Imagine that there are a bunch of like little yous running around in your head, and when you see a stove that you've never used before, the little yous run to like a filing cabinet and they like look up stove and they like pull the file and they're like, oh yeah, we've seen something similar enough to this before. And they say, okay, like we know what to do with this, and then you're able to use the stove. The problem is that sometimes our mind makes incorrect associations. Sometimes one of the little us's will like pull a file incorrectly. So let's say that in the past, we have been in a relationship with someone who was really abusive and smoked. And so then if we get into a new relationship with a really, really nice guy, but he smokes, our mind may associate him smoking with that abusive relationship. And so even though the guy hasn't done anything wrong, we may start to have like all of these negative feelings and associations toward this guy because of the previous guy. And so by identifying that those feelings are coming from the previous guy, it helps us to process those emotions more accurately. Because if we try to process the emotion for this guy, there's nothing really there. But if we process the emotions through things like validation for the past experience, then we can actually start to process the emotions. Which leads very well into a very important emotional processing technique, which is shifting narratives. So the idea of shifting narratives is basically that we are just teaching the little guy in our mind that like pulls the file. If he pulls it incorrectly, we're sort of teaching him like, hey buddy, like this is actually a different situation. You actually don't need to pull the file here. But if we just tell him that straight up, he's not going to listen to us, because most of the time these other parts of ourselves don't trust us yet because of the way that we have communicated with them in the past. Remember when I was talking to you about those ineffective communication tools like problem solving and reassurance? So when these parts of us have like spoken up before, we've been like, no, it's okay. And then they feel ignored. And so they dig their heels in deeper. So it is very important that when you first start to notice an association like this, that you validate it, that you say something like, hey, I can really understand why you feel unsafe in this situation with this guy who smokes, because you were in a really awful relationship with a guy who smoked in the past. And so this feels very similar. I can definitely understand that. And as you do that, pay attention to how that part of you reacts. Now, in order to start this process, the emotions have to be present. If you just do this intellectually, it's not going to work. You have to actually feel the emotions. And so as we start out, it may be enough to just think about them and write about them, to remember them. But as we continue going forward, what may happen is you may start to feel that you're feeling like less and less emotional as you go through this process. And when that happens, or if that happens, it is important that you start to go out into the world and actually have experiences that allow you to show this part of yourself that the narrative is different now. Because what's going to happen is as you go out into the world, you are going to start to experience some of those emotions. The little guy is going to like pull the file again. And it is your job when that happens to validate him, to be like, yeah, dude, I can totally understand why you are feeling this way in this moment because XYZ. And as you do that more and more, the association will start to get disconnected. So, instead of the little guy thinking that the stove is a toilet or the toilet is a stove, he'll start to understand the difference between the two. Now, sometimes the emotions are going to be too powerful for you to be able to emotionally process in that moment. And that is totally okay. That is part of the process. When that kind of thing happens, grounding techniques are really, really useful. So the idea of a grounding technique is that it is something that helps to fill up the space in your mind so all of the emotions sort of get pushed out. Because in that moment, that's what you need. You need to like push the emotions away for a minute so that you can like recenter yourself. So anything that helps you to fill up your mind, and different things work for different people. So for some people, a really effective grounding technique is to take a deep breath in, take a deep breath out, completely empty your stomach of air, and hold it there. And then focus on all of the sensations that you can feel. Focus on the feeling of your feet on the ground, your butt in your seat, your hands in your lap. Focus on all the sensations that you can feel. And it will help to ground you in this present moment and fill up your mind so that it is not overwhelmed by emotions. If you find that that is not powerful enough and that you have an extremely active mind, one thing that can really help for some people is to start to play some sounds, like on a YouTube video or something, some very noisy sounds, and start to focus on all of the sounds that you can hear, and sort of bounce your focus in between all of the sounds that you can hear. Don't stay on any one sound for any length of time. And as you bounce between these sounds, doing that and having to, continually bounce, continually find new sounds, it helps to fill up your mind in a similar way. It's just that this way is even more stimulating. So those are the tools for emotional processing. And now that you've got those on your like Batman tool belt, let's dive into disempowerment.